Now, what is striking about Barker's argument and those promulgated by British observers at the time was that precisely because of what they saw as the sophistication and accuracy of these devices, they asserted that they must be extremely ancient. High science meant antiquity. So what one sees, very commonly argued right through to the 1780s and 90s by British observers and by their interlocutors, is that these observatories must have been built perhaps some centuries ago under the direction of the great Akbar, that's the Mughal emperor. This is the view of Sayyid Din Muhammad, who traveled along the Ganges and then came to Britain in the 1790s, or indeed the company astronomer Reuben Burrow, who reckoned that this observatory at Varanasi, with its large quadrant, must have been placed in the meridian when the observatory was erected, and that must be at an immemorially ancient moment. Now, in fact, as scholars such as Raymond Mercier have taught us, this was not at all the case. On the contrary, these observatories were built under the orders of the Jaipur ruler, Jai Singh, Sawai Jai Singh, from the 1710s through the 1730s. And as this diagram is supposed to represent, these observatories were the result, as many of you will know, of an extraordinarily impressive network of collaborative labor, bringing together Sanskritic, Islamic, and perhaps above all, European traditions, mediated partly through Lisbon, the physician Pedro da Silva, and the agent Manuel Figueiredo, Jesuit at Agra, who under the orders of Jai Singh, arrived in Jaipur in the 1730s, bringing with them the decisive astronomical tables on which a great deal of this work relied. So this is a heteroclite, eclectic, international project, closely linked with political attempts to reinforce the status of the Mughal regime and the personal status of Jai Singh. But as I want to emphasize, to the initial British observers of this system, the apparent sophistication of these setups was taken to be a mark of their immense antiquity. It was not until the 1790s that British scholars based at the Asiatic Society in Kolkata, based normally at the Writers' Building, the building you see on the right in central Kolkata in the 1790s, that the Society's secretary, William Hunter, and others were able to argue that, on the contrary, we'd been wrong. These observatories must be of a comparatively modern date. And here's the irony: because modern, so Hunter argued, they must be of European construction. So at least two historical narratives were in play. On the one hand, the view that these were sophisticated traces of astral science so immemorially ancient, from which, as the British understood, like all Asiatic systems, this was the British claim, they had degenerated and declined, or alternatively, they were recent and modern, in which case they were to be understood as effectively European. In the balance of my talk, I want to explore that polarity between a claim for great antiquity and a claim for a correspondence with European knowledge, as it was worked out in one specific case, a case which has not been nearly as closely studied as that of the Jai Singh program. This was a violent argument, so it was reported, about the age and status of Hindu astronomy, as it was called, held at the Asiatic Society and in private in Kolkata in May of 1803. The two protagonists were, on the one hand, John Bentley. John Bentley, about whom rather little can now be found, was an insurance agent, a banker, a trader, an expert calculator, and a metrologist, that's to say, an expert on measurement standards as they were used in the Bengali trade. Bentley argued that what he called Brahminical or Hindu astronomy was recent, it was modern, and it was forged. It was faked from European sources. And then that forgery, so Bentley argued, had been covered up by Brahmins and other informants in disguising and embellishing their history with allegory and fiction. The alternative view, developed by the brilliant mathematician, astronomer, economic administrator, and calculator Henry Colebrook, was that Sanskritic astral sciences were in fact ancient, but they were therefore inaccurate and essentially unreliable. As you see here, Colebrook's riposte to Bentley was, Bentley concludes forgery and imposture where I only infer carelessness and inaccuracy. In order to understand the violence of that exchange, we need to put it into the political and cultural context of the company and the Asiatic Society of this conjuncture. And the key figure, perhaps, in explaining the violence of this is the figure of Henry Dundas. And you've seen this image, I'm desperately hoping, on the splendidly designed poster announcement for this talk. Henry Dundas, 1 foot in Leadenhall Street, which was the London headquarters of the East India Company, and the other in the province of Bengal. And it's perhaps not a coincidence that in this magnificent caricature of Dundas, his Scottish allegiance is marked by the fact that he's wearing a kilt and rather splendid tartan socks. And his astronomical interests are unmissable in that he's reaching for the sun and the moon. Dundas, as we'll see, was the effective ruler of Scotland and the chief administrator of the East India Company on behalf of the British government at this period. Two of his obsessions matter to my argument. On the one hand, Dundas took an extraordinarily forward view about the predicament of what he understood as Hindu religion. Right through the 1790s and well into the 1820s, figures like Bentley and their allies argued that the company should at last be permitted to introduce Christian missionaries into its territories. This was called the Pious Clause. The regulation of the company had until then forbidden proselytization in India, and Dundas backed that ban. So in a speech against the Pious Clause, he argues that the Hindus, though they are a timid and innocent people, have been singularly bigoted in their religious prejudices. That was his view. And therefore, it would be dangerous to British and company rule to unleash the force of Christian evangelism in India. On the other hand, Dundas was a ferocious anti-Jacobin right through the period of what the British choose to call the French Wars of the 1790s through 1815. Dundas thundered about the threat of what he understood as Jacobinism. I hate Jacobinism everywhere, he argued, but in India, I should consider it as the devil itself. So on the one hand, an extraordinarily complicated attitude to indigenous religious belief. On the other hand, an insistence on the dangers of political radicalism developing within the company territory. This would have important effects on the ways in which astral sciences would be understood by company servants and their allies. This understanding, of course, relied on go-betweens, on intermediaries. Henry Colebrook, for example, who was in fact the Sanskrit professor at the Company College in Fort William. He was more or less the first European to hold such a chair in Sanskrit anywhere, urged that a separate department for Sanskrit be set up, that it be staffed with pundits, that these should produce dictionaries and handbooks for company servants who would be trained in the language of the gods. That would raise enormously important questions about the trustworthiness and authority of native informants, go-betweens, and intermediaries. Sorry. The reason this was so complex is because company servants were extremely suspicious of what they understood as Brahmin or indigenous informants. On the one hand, I'm quoting here from the erstwhile Governor General, John Shaw, Lord Teignmouth, it was widely held by company officials that Brahmins were incommunicative, that they possessed secret doctrines, but they would not communicate them. On the other hand, it was equally widely held by many company servants that in the case, for example, of the astral sciences, Brahmins were well capable of reasonably accurate astral calculation embodied in their almanacs, that they could, as you see here, calculate eclipses with considerable exactness, but this was decisive. They were, so Dundas was told in 1788, altogether ignorant of the principles on which their calculations depend. So, to summarize, it was argued that these intermediaries knew a great deal but wouldn't communicate, and on the other hand, that they were very proficient, but they were theoretically ignorant. For this reason, as Thomas Troutman and others have taught us, an enormously important set of projects was launched from the Asiatic Society under the leadership of figures such as the lawyer and antiquarian William Jones, to see if it was possible somehow to rely on pundits and decode the secret knowledge that they allegedly possessed. And here's a page from Jones's notebook in which he's speculating on the coincidence of what he understood as Hindu chronology with Christian theology, a flood like that of Noah. And he moves effortlessly between that form of decoding and arguments about how pundits, how informants and translators should be regulated. Should they be paid? Should they attend law courts? And so on. One of Jones's most important disciples and admirers was Thomas Morris, who was effectively the company's chief mythographer, who, as you see here, also, like Jones, tried to decode Sanskrit astral science and cosmology to show its coincidence with scriptural knowledge. So I've juxtaposed here a 1760s image from northern India, or from the Dasavatara, with the version that Morris produced in his own work, and the idea that Morris had that what such images showed was a knowledge of Noah's flood. Very significantly, for Jones and for Morris, it was absolutely fundamental that Brahmin writers were extremely knowledgeable, that their knowledge would blended the sciences with theology, but that it was hidden from European interlocutors. And on the other hand, as we're about to see, Morris and Jones also reckoned that, I quote from Morris, India was the debatable ground on which the fury of Jacobin hostility has reared her most triumphant banner. So for Thomas Morris, getting Hindu astral sciences right was part of the Dundasian struggle against French, enlightened, Jacobin, materialist irreligion. It was a political project. The reason for the views of Jones and Morris on these matters was because a great deal of what the British knew of Sanskritic astral science was mediated through a small group of Paris astronomers, notably Le Gentil, who had come to southern India in the 1760s to observe the Venus transit from Pondicherry, and who, based in southern India, had worked closely with the Brahmin Nana Motu to be trained in Sanskritic methods for calculating eclipses. Le Gentil had accumulated, with Jesuit assistance, a number of Sanskritic catalogues and almanacs, and these were then made available to the eminent Parisian astronomer, Jean Bailly, who was based at the Louvre Observatory in Paris, who, as you see here in the 1780s, argued for an original and primitive astronomy in India, that it was centered in Varanasi, in Benares, and that, as you see from the juxtaposition of the data here, for example, on year length, on planetary motion, especially on planetary position, these were tables of startling accuracy. Bailly's arguments even convinced the doyen of Parisian science, Parisian astronomy, Pierre-Simon Laplace, that the agreement of these numbers testifies with even more verisimilitude to the high antiquity of the astronomical determinations of the Indians. And here was the crucial point that Bailly and Laplace would make, that these must have been made by observation as long ago as 3102 before the Common Era, because it was inconceivable that these astronomers knew the gravitational Newtonian theory, which allowed enlightened French astronomy retrospectively to make these calculations. So Brahmin ignorance of theoretical astronomy was used as an argument to assert the immense antiquity of the observational tradition that Indian astronomy had reached. These publications from enlightened and then revolutionary Jacobin Paris were greeted with peculiar enthusiasm in Edinburgh, the headquarters of the British Enlightenment. So once again, the link between Dundas, India, Scotland, and astronomy proves fundamental. This is a magnificent cartoon of Dundas when he was briefly out of office in eclipse, linking together his astronomical interests, his Scottish character, and his political role in India. His annual round the world, it is in Scotland and in India that you may take the best observation of him. Edinburgh mattered because it was the urban forum for enlightened reflection on stadial theories of social development and evolution. Adam Smith had written, indeed, an entire history of astronomy based on these models of social development. And it's no coincidence that the Enlightenment Bible, the Edinburgh Encyclopedia, illustrated what an astronomical observatory looked like by juxtaposing images of the observatory in Edinburgh, the observatory in Naples, and the observatory in Benares, in Varanasi. Three Edinburgh-based scholars took up the arguments of Le Gentil and of Bailly. First of all, the Edinburgh professor of law, Alan McConaughey, who insisted that the Brahmins had calculated an eclipse duration more accurately than Le Gentil, that the duration of their years were more exact than that of Greece or Egypt, and that they'd observed the obliquity of the ecliptic 7,600 years ago. McConaughey actively lobbied Dundas, therefore, to spend public money on research in India, in Calcutta and Benares into Sanskrit astronomy. So did McConaughey's closest ally, the mathematics professor in Edinburgh, John Playfair. Playfair significantly argued that the only way of understanding ancient history was by astronomical methods in the absence of any other form of literary remains. He argued magnificently that the match between ancient Indian observations and modern European theory is, and I quote, perhaps the most striking example of the progress and vicissitudes of science which the history of mankind has yet exhibited. And he insisted, as we saw in the case of the Jai Singh project, that though that had been known anciently, Brahmins had now forgotten the theory they once knew. If this be true, Playfair argued, it indicates a retrograde order in the progress of Eastern science, which must have had its origin in a very remote age. These views were embalmed and most authoritatively developed in the work of the man who patronized both McConaughey and Playfair, William Robertson, the head of Edinburgh University, the chief historian in Scotland, the head of the Scottish Church. He argued in his historical writings on India for the early and high state of Indian civilization. He argued for the uniqueness of the Sanskritic tradition. And above all, he argued for the significance of the astral sciences that he imagined were pursued in Varanasi and Benares, which he labeled the Athens of India. And now that Benares is subject to the dominion of the company, Great Britain may have the glory of exploring fully that extensive field of unknown science. So let's just resume, as we move into the final sections of the paper, what the task here involved. It was a task of scriptural reconciliation and of historical interpretation. As I've tried to show in these diagrams, Christian scriptural tradition, certainly that practiced in Edinburgh and Paris and Kolkata, had the biblical deluge occurring around 2100 BCE. And by evaluating Sanskrit records of the position of the equinoxes, the position of the summer solstice, and the obliquity of the ecliptic, both of which moved secularly over the ages, it should in principle be possible, this was the argument, precisely to date the moment when those observations had been made. So that, for example, as you see here, for an obliquity of the ecliptic larger than 24, one would have observations that were antediluvian. And the consequences of that were, in principle at least, threatening for orthodox scriptural interpretation. They would mark the survival in India of forms of knowledge practiced before what had been allegedly a universal deluge. Bentley's argument was that this was all nonsense. For Bentley, Sanskritic tables were recent, and he based his argument on the claim that the date when a group of astronomical tables are manufactured will be the date when its errors, that's to say, the difference between its data and the data retrospectively calculated by modern British enlightened astronomy, are least. His argument was that these errors, in the case of the most significant Sanskritic astral scientific tables, was about 1100 or 1091 of the Common Era. And so, according to Bentley, these tables must not have been produced thousands of years ago, but only 700 or 800 years ago. The implication of this, according to Bentley, was that the authors and peddlers of these texts had committed literary forgery, and they'd antedated the material that the pundits were offering to their British informants. He argued that, and I quote from Bentley, the most candid part of the Hindus acknowledge that literary forgeries are frequently committed. And I'm showing you here from the Sanskrit collection that Bentley assembled, now held in the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, a diagram, significantly a tychonic diagram, that Bentley imagined for what he called the Hindu solar system. So this was the basis of the fight between Bentley and Colebrooke. For Colebrooke, the authority of the pundits relied on the notion that texts were constantly commented, interpreted, and so on, and therefore these texts could be trusted if one understood them as a dynamic, mutable, and evolving tradition. For Bentley, on the other hand, the situation was much more catastrophic and dramatic. Bentley made this remarkable claim about the origin of the texts with which Europeans were provided about Sanskritic astral sciences. Bentley told this story that the apostle St. Thomas had arrived in southern India about the year 51 CE, that the Brahmins had then apparently discovered that they were far behind in point of antiquity, their account of the creation going back only to the year 2352 BC, the year of the deluge, and the Brahmins feared that they would be considered a modern people in respect of the rest of the world. So sometime in the 5th and 6th centuries of our era, according to Bentley, the Brahmins resolved to change the time of creation, making it appear by means of a false history that all men sprang from them, and that such conjunctions might be considered as the real, genuine, and indisputable periods of history founded on actual observations. So this was the nature of the dispute that racked British astral Orientalism in the first decade of the 19th century. On the one hand, the claim by Colebrook and his allies that the Sanskritic tradition was ancient but imperfect, and the argument by Bentley and his allies that the Sanskrit tradition was perfect and therefore clearly faked. This was, in closing, by no means the only example of such furious fights in this period about the authority of apparently ancient antediluvian schemes. Many of you, I guess, will be familiar with the case of the Dendera Zodiac in the Nile Valley, encountered by French engineers, astronomers, mathematicians, and travelers during the period of the French occupation of Egypt from 1799. French astronomers and other men of science like Joseph Fourier argued that what this showed was a real image of the zodiac, that it was immemorially ancient, it dated to at least 2000 BCE, and was therefore evidence of the non-universality of the flood. And the response to these claims, the highly skeptical response by Georges Cuvier, who argued both in the case of the Dendera Zodiac and in the case of Bentley's argument that, and I quote from Cuvier, the Indians have no history. It has come to be recognized that their Surya Siddhanta, in other words, their astral tables, which they regard as their most ancient scientific treatise on astronomy, could only have been composed 750 years ago. On the other hand, Cuvier insisted what the Sanskrit tradition revealed was Hindu knowledge of a universal flood. So what I've tried to offer you here is a micro history of a series of tense exchanges within Anglophone and Francophone intellectual circles in the decades just before and after 1800, at a period that the great historian Chris Bailey calls the imperial meridian, in which judgments of antiquity were always also judgments about astral sciences and judgments about civilizational development. It would be easy, and perhaps it would be right, to dismiss arguments such as those of John Bentley as without consequences. However, as I show you here, Bentley's work had an extraordinary influence on racist British arguments about Indian civilization. James Mill's History of British India, composed between 1806 and 1818, and then made a compulsory textbook for East India Company servants from the 1820s, explicitly endorsed Bentley's argument. That work, so Mill argued, must meet with a favorable reception from every man who feels an interest in the early history of that extraordinary people, the Hindus. What Mill was arguing was that this kind of work would put scholars on their guard against the dishonest inventions of the priests and check their disgraceful love of literary imposture. What I think lies behind the debates about astral science that I've summarized here is the ambiguity of the phrase, the dishonest inventions of the priests. James Mill and his allies meant both Brahmins and Anglicans. Again and again, what we see in these debates is the application of encounters in India to the predicament of Enlightenment, Jacobin, and post-revolutionary Europe. That entanglement, I think, should continue to inform our understanding of the remarkable history of Orientalism and its consequences for the history of the sciences. Thank you very much indeed for your patience.